Good morning in the Americas, good afternoon in Africa and Europe, good evening in Asia, and welcome to a global conversation on explaining the US election to the world and how the world is reacting to the US election. I'm Adam Powell, I'm Director of Washington Programs of the USC Annenberg Center for Communication, Leadership, and Policy. Also, as you just saw, Executive Director of the USC Election Cybersecurity Initiative. The Annenberg Center for Communication, Leadership, and Policy sponsors these programs. We have a full agenda with panelists standing by across the globe, so let's get underway. First, this program is being recorded. I know that many of you regulars are used to this being off the record. We no longer can say they're off the record with Zoom, so now we're just saying they're being recorded and they're on the record. Very quickly, our next program will be January 4th, first Monday program with Tom Kent, former CEO of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, who will be talking about overt and covert options to combat Russian disinformation. First, we always go to Ambassador Greta Morris, who has taken these programs to a new level. Greta has advised us she's having some technical issues today, so it falls to me to introduce our first speaker, Singapore's ambassador to the United States, known to most of you from his appearances at our first Monday forums. The Honorable Ashok Mirpuri took up his appointment as Singapore's ambassador in July of 2012, so he's been here through, this will be his third administration. Prior to his appointment, he served as ambassador to Indonesia from 2006 to 2012, High Commissioner in Malaysia, 2002 to 2006, and High Commissioner to Australia from 2000 to 2002. He's a career diplomat. He graduated with an honors degree from the National University of Singapore. He receives an MA at the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies under a Raffles Scholarship. He attended the program for executive development at the Institute for Management Development in Switzerland and the Advanced Management Program at the Harvard Business School. So we welcome Ambassador Mirpuri.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak to the group again, even though this time is virtually rather than in person. It's interesting that we can do this virtually because everyone is now all over the world. I am in Singapore, it's 11 p.m., and I'm sitting in quarantine because Singapore requires that if you're coming into the country, you go into this moat for 2 weeks and you cannot leave your room. They keep an eye on you. They leave food outside for you to eat, and then you have to have a negative PCR test before they let you out. But it's the price of being able to see my family for the holidays. And it is the ability of Singapore to really bring COVID under control. So we have very, very few in-community cases today. We had a large spike earlier in the year, but now there are very few in-community cases. Most days there's no community cases. The cases that do come up every day, and today there are 15 people who've come from outside, imported cases, sitting through the quarantine, who are tested and then found to have COVID. And that's sort of really one part of what Singapore's had to do is really very active testing as well as tracing. In addition to a very strict testing regime, we've also put in place a tracing regime. You download on your phone a tracing app, or you're given a token for tracing. And if you are in contact for an extended period with someone who's later found to have developed COVID, it's much easier for the contact tracers to get in touch with you. And we think that with testing and tracing, we can start opening up the economy. So in many ways, Singapore's starting to feel normal. Everyone wears a mask, but people are going around. If you look at all the statistics, there is movement around the city. And vaccines, the Prime Minister spoke last night about vaccines. We'll be getting our first vaccines later this month. We've given approval to the Pfizer vaccine. We're also buying the Moderna vaccine. And by the first half or the third quarter of 2021, everyone in Singapore would have been vaccinated for free. Every citizen, every long-term resident would have been vaccinated. And that's an important part of sort of really getting Singapore back on track, because COVID has been a very difficult time, for a very globalized city to have to shut everything down, to shut down the airport, to shut down the movement of people, to shut down business. And one vote of confidence was a week ago. The World Economic Forum said they're going to move Davos 2021 from Switzerland to Singapore in May. So in the middle of May, the World Economic Forum will be in Singapore. And at the end of May will be the traditional Shangri-La dialogue that Singapore hosts for regional security issues, also in person, or well, both will be in some sort of hybrid fashion, but people will be here in person. And I really think that these two conferences will be a way for us to start addressing, for leaders, business leaders, political leaders, to get together to start addressing the post-COVID world. Because I think there's lots of lessons that we have taken from this. It's also useful for me that I am now outside of the US, watching the US on TV or everything I'm reading. As Adam says, I've been in Washington, DC for 8 years. This is my fifth election, 3 presidential elections and 2 midterms. And until, it's always been interesting, but this has been particularly interesting to watch, not just within the US, where lots of you're obviously very consumed by that, but looking at it from the outside. And I want to talk about 3 broad themes as the world looks at the US, because I think as we approach the issues of how the world looks at what's going on in the US today, I see 3 very broad themes. First, the issue of democracy. Second, the issue of multilateralism. And third, the issue of trade. And all of these sort of come together in the areas that I think we have to anticipate for the future. First, around democracy. The Electoral College, obviously yesterday, has finally ratified President-elect Joe Biden as the president-elect. The rest of the world actually accepted it the first weekend after the election, because we all sent our congratulatory messages to the president-elect and the vice president-elect by the 7th or 8th of November. And then started to realize that actually they're fairly complicated constitutional issues, which in my 2 previous times of watching presidential elections in Washington, DC, no one even knew which day the Electoral College met. Suddenly we had to think about, the first Monday after the third Wednesday, the complications of the whole process. And in fact, I think the only person who got it right was President Putin of Russia, who only congratulated the president-elect after the Electoral College gave its go-ahead. President Trump, of course, has not yet conceded the election. But looking at it from the outside, in many ways, there's a lot of questioning of what is this whole process going on in the US, where we've always understood the US as really that sort of model for democracy. In fact, several Southeast Asian countries, the Philippines and Indonesia, have modeled their sort of modern constitutions, post-dictatorship constitutions on the United States. And for them to look at how this process goes through, in a way, they're starting to question this sort of constant challenging, using legal processes, finding all sorts of ways to sort of delay a process. And I'm still hearing that even on the January the 6th, there are still people thinking of contesting further this possibility of the president's final sort of stamp of authority. So it does impact the way the world starts to see the US. And if this is going to be a factor of US political life in the future, because elections are always going to be close, there are always going to be voters who may feel disenfranchised, there are always going to be voters who may feel they're being excluded. I think that the US is starting to look a little less shiny from the outside world because of this experience of democracy. The other thing is multilateralism. The multilateral world in many ways was shaped after the Second World War, when the US was very much the global superpower. And that multilateral world has served the world very well. It has served small countries like Singapore. Singapore only became independent 55 years ago, but our success has really been in a multilateral framework that the US has helped set up. Now, the US itself is starting to question this multilateral framework. And rather than try to address some of the issues in the multilateral framework that are, admittedly 70, 75 years old, is the UN still relevant with 5 permanent members of the Security Council who maintain a veto when these are no longer necessarily the most powerful countries in the world? Why doesn't Germany why doesn't Germany have a place there? Why doesn't Japan have a place there? But rather than try and fix the system, the US seems to be walking away from the system. The World Trade Organization, yes, it's not, there are failures or mistakes that sort of is not as successful as it should be. Why doesn't the US get into fixing these things? The WHO, when the US was unhappy about the WHO because of the COVID response, rather than try and fix it, it is a process of walking away. And for small countries, really, this multilateral world has been most important to our success, and a multilateral world defined by US rules. And the US following these rules, because that's what gave the US that credibility. It wasn't military power that helped shape the world. It was this US credibility and approach of dealing towards multilateralism. And that's one thing that, particularly the COVID crisis has started to, again, ask people to question, where is this multilateral world going to go if you do not have the US playing a significant role? If the US is no longer sort of even speaking of putting vaccines out into some sort of multilateral diplomacy. Yes, we understand why every country needs vaccines for their own people, but the whole idea of vaccine diplomacy, the US has not participated in any of these sort of facilities that are there to participate in terms of global sort of engagement. The third area after democracy and multilateralism is trade. And again, the success of the US model, particularly in Southeast Asia, particularly for countries of ASEAN and Singapore, has been around trade. Yes, there's been an active US military presence, and Singapore has been a very strong military partner of the US, but there's also been a very strong economic engagement. And in many ways, this is what has created the success of the region. And in the region, we have now several economic architectures, unfortunately, neither of which the US has decided to associate itself with. There's a very high standard agreement, in fact, which the US helped negotiate, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And in 2017, the US walked away from the TPP, leaving 11 countries sort of uncertain what to do. Under the leadership of Japanese Prime Minister Abe, we then reformed it as a comprehensive and progressive TPP, and that's been very successful, a very high standard. And in fact, countries are now thinking of joining it. The United Kingdom, as they leave Europe, as Brexit happens, is thinking of joining CPTPP. South Korea is thinking of coming in. Thailand's thinking of coming in. And even the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, said at the APEC meeting that he thinks China should join the CPTPP. And it's an essential part of the economic geography of the region. And the US has walked away from it. Another thing happened a few weeks ago. 15 countries, 10 ASEAN countries with China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand signed a RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. 10 years of negotiation, a lower standard agreement, I must admit, but really one, again, centered around ASEAN pulling together countries of the region. ASEAN has free trade agreements with each one of these countries, each one of the 5, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, but now we've put it all together. And interestingly, China, Japan, and Korea do not have an agreement among themselves. The only agreement that they have now is around this ASEAN framework. And India was a very active negotiating right to the end, but decided that it could not participate in it for various domestic reasons. And we hope they will come back to it. So you have this large economic geographies, and really that is where the center of the action is moving for the sort of global economy. And the US needs to find a way, as they did before, to get back into this trade engagement. And particularly with ASEAN, where the US has committed so much support and effort in terms of building up the region, that's where sort of the effort should go into. So it's really looking from the outside, the issues of democracy, multilateralism, trade are the 3 issues that we're looking at of how is the Biden administration going to start dealing with this as they sort of take office, and what sort of future they're going to define for the United States. Let me stop over there, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you especially for joining us in the middle of the night there in Singapore. We have a question from Michael Anderson. You need to unmute yourself if you can.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, good evening, Mr. Ambassador. Selamat malam. Quick question. Congratulations to Singapore for landing the very prestigious World Economic Forum conference next year. I think Singapore is probably the only country in the world at this time that could host such an event. Could you tell us a little more about the practical side of what you plan to do? Are you going to give everybody a test before they enter the country? Are you going to make sure everybody has a vaccine injection, or what are you trying to do in very practical conference going terms? Take care, I'll go on.
Yeah, well, thank you. And yes, it is an important conference, and it's a particularly important conference because of where we are and the issues that need to be brought into discussion for the world community. The World Economic Forum, as you know, brings together both political leaders as well as business leaders, and really helping to define what can go into that. There are certain protocols that we will start working with World Economic Forum on, and we really haven't quite worked it out. The vaccine has just appeared. Now, if people who are vaccinated, do they have to have a vaccine passport to come out? I haven't heard any discussion anywhere, not in the US, not in the UK, that have started vaccinating people, that they're actually giving people a vaccine passport. We'll have to think about, will there be such a thing as a vaccine passport? But let me tell you about some of the protocols that we're using today. While someone like me, because I want to spend time with my family, have to go through a 14-day quarantine, we have created green lanes and business lanes for people to come in without the quarantine process, but with regular testing. So if you come in as a business person from, say, Japan or China, we've got reciprocal green lanes, and there's a very controlled itinerary. You need a negative test before you get on the plane. You need to be tested as you arrive. And when you arrive, you can go straight to work, but within a controlled itinerary. One car, use the same car throughout, stay with the same group. Don't go wandering about. You cannot go and eat at our hawker centers. So we keep them insulated from the community, but let them carry on work. That's one model that is carrying on. Another model that we've just announced today, we're going to create little bubble hotels near the airport, where people from the region who need to do business can just fly in, of course, with negative tests, but don't mix with the community, but speak among themselves. You may have a regional office, head office in Singapore, and you need to bring the people in from Bangkok for a couple of days of meeting. You fly them in, put them in that bubble hotel, can give them training. And so we're looking at all sorts of models, and we're sort of really being quite creative of what we can do. By the time we get to the World Economic Forum, I'm presuming it's going to be hybrid. Some people will be virtual, some people will be online, present. The way we're doing some of the events today, last week, the Milken Asia did their first in-person conference with, I think, about 100 people, but broken up into groups of 50. We've also developed different types of tests, very quick reaction tests. There's a breathalyzer test that gives a result in 15 minutes. Not 100% accurate, not as accurate as the PCR test, but good enough to check whether somebody may be COVID positive or not. So all these measures we put in place, and I hope that we can sort of announce them as we get closer to the date of the World Economic Forum. Thank you.
We have a question from Ambassador Cynthia Efford.
I just wondered, you're of course quite right that our reputation as being the gold standard for elections every time there's no problem, there's no drama, has been disturbed, shall we say. But I wonder if there might be a positive side. I know in many countries I've been, the feeling has been, well, of course the United States has no problem with their elections. And perhaps now that we have proven that we too have to work at maintaining our democracy, that this could even be a positive thing, or is that too optimistic?
No, I'm hopeful. President-elect Biden and his team have spoken about a summit of democracies to reinforce the idea of how important democracy is. I think that in the end, because you have a very you have a system that works at states and county level, that may actually be the strength. Because if you see some of the local state secretaries of state and others who have responded to this, they've responded very much in the proper fashion. And I think that's the strength of the system. But each system, I think that where there have been challenges, it's a question of trying to fix it. Florida in 2000, there were issues around, remember the sort of chads and all that. Florida, in fact, has run the election very, very well because they took the mistakes or the sort of lapses of 2000 and have improved the system so tremendously that they were, despite being a very important state, they could get results out quite quickly. Now, the other states should learn from this so that you can avoid sort of some of the mistakes. So I'm optimistic that these things can be fixed. It's always, I mean, you look at the problems and then you try and fix it. So that should be fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We promise to let you go at this late hour in Singapore. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your remarks. And we look forward to seeing you when you're back in Washington.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and have a good meeting and happy holidays to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. And let's stay in Asia now, where it is even later in Korea, with Insun Kang, who's the Deputy Managing Editor of Chosun Ilbo. She is also someone known to our regulars because she also has spoken at our forums here in Washington when she was Washington Bureau Chief of Chosun Media. So she has an interesting perspective because she has covered President Trump and is now back in Korea as editor of a newspaper. So let's go to Insun Kang in Seoul.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for inviting me to this, great forum and discussion. And back in Korea, I have been watching the U.S. election very closely, and now I would like to start with saying how I felt about the result when we got the result that Biden won. I thought I was released from Trump presidency. I thought I was kidnapped for 4 years because I couldn't take my eyes off from him, because my work is writing about him while I was in Washington, D.C. It was from 2016 to 2020, early this year, by February. So I had to write about President Trump every day. And so now I don't need to write about him anymore. So I felt like I am finally released from that presidency. So I would like to explain how US presidential election is explained and built in South Korea. Well, like in many other countries, we are very interested in the whole process. And we have been watching we are watching like a sports games. Political race is much more like sports games because it has winners and losers and scores and lots of dramas in that. But in this case, I thought it was like this election is like a mirror. It reflects the aspects of the United States that we haven't thought of before. We had to learn details of the rules and the systems and laws and everything related with election. But we still had to struggle with the how should we understand that weird aspects of unusual aspects of the election rules, of course, that electoral college and the winner takes it all type of things. So it's very complicated and unusual. So which is very kind of strange for us. So we had to deal with the possibility of uncertainty by the end of the election. And Koreans are interested in this election because it will affect a lot about our alliance system. As you may have known, this South Korea is, I guess, one of the country which is affected by the Trump presidency a lot. When you think of those Kim Jong-un and Trump summit in Singapore in 2018, and there are another meeting at the Hanoi and another one at DMZ, which was so dramatic event. So we expected something big could happen to the situation of the Korean Peninsula, but actually it didn't. But we were always under that kind of uncertainty while Trump was in his office. And that there are other issues like burden sharing negotiation, and he stopped the US South Korea joint military exercise, and there's always a possibility of his decision to change the current state of the North and South Korea. So that's why we were so interested in the whole process. And the other thing I mean, as a media person, I'm a journalist, we are trying to convey and explain how important it is to have a stable and predictable US leadership in the world. I thought it was very precious public goods for all over the world. So I think this is a very interesting process that let us understand the US system and how important it is for us to have US as a stable leadership. Yeah, I will stop here. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And we understand it's after midnight now in Korea. So if you need to leave, please, we understand. But thank you for joining us.
Okay.
Let's continue westward and let's get to Anton Harber joining us from Johannesburg. Anton is the founder and editor of one of the 4 anti-apartheid newspapers in South Africa some decades ago. And now he teaches journalism at the University of Witwatersrand. Anton, over to you.
Well, let me say just a few words. I think that in this part of the world, people are quite startled by what they've learned about America and things that we were confident about and are no longer confident about in relation to American democracy and the effectiveness of the American system to deal with the issues and problems it faces. I think that it's been quite profound in challenging many certainties and quite worrying in some of the examples it potentially sets for leaders in other parts of the world. I think that we had made assumptions about the strength of the American Constitution. We had made assumptions about the acceptance of democratic practices in the American system and democratic rules of procedure and ethics. We had made assumptions about the ability of various parts of the system to constrain leaders, particularly leaders who are challenging democracy. But maybe most of all, we had made assumptions about free expression and free media in America. That's often been held up as an example in places like Africa. And to see that so deeply challenged and so vulnerable and so uncertain has left, I think, a sense of bewilderment and rethinking about these things, which has healthy elements because many of those assumptions needed to be challenged. But I think it also potentially, and the greatest concern is that, for example, in the fight for more free expression, more open societies, more free media, some of the examples we have seen in the conduct of the American media, and in the attitude of the outgoing president and the way he treated the media. These are all worrying examples, worrying role models, worrying patterns and practices for those of us who are struggling to defend and grow open societies in this part of the world. Let me leave it at that.
Thank you, and I'm sure we'll be picking up the very themes you just outlined in our discussion a little later. Let's go up now, not geographically, but in terms of coverage area, to Al Jazeera. Jeff Ballou is with us. He's the news editor for the Americas for Al Jazeera Media. Jeff, how have you been explaining the American election to Al Jazeera's readers, listeners, and viewers.
Thank you, Adam. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Good. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks to University of Southern California in Annenberg. I'll try to run down some quick points because I think the way Al Jazeera Media Network, at least the English language channel, approached it was to go down several paths at the same time. Recognizing that our audience is global, even though we're hubbed in Doha, people look at us much like they look at the BBC, much as they look like at Reuters, much as they look at Sky, and so forth. But what we had to do was go down the lane of explaining what the process is, for 18 months, constantly having to remind our viewers how the American system and all of its quirks work. The second is the substantive aspect, and actually splits into sort of two categories. One, what the issues were at stake, issue by issue, and as far as the election, and the other one is how did those issues have ripple effects across the globe. And a third lane that we had to travel is how it affects, bringing in our correspondents from all over the planet from time to time to remind our viewers how different parts of the world are seeing the election. And then, as the ambassador alluded to early on, before we got into the panel, is to talk about what happens to the various relationships that are around the world, because the legacy of the Trump era and what the Biden era promises to be, and what baggage does he bring to the table, what promises does he bring to the table, his team brings to the table, and talk about that. And we also had to deal with, we talk about free expression, about the legacy of a free press. It's anybody who looks at my bio understands that, having been president of the National Press Club, having been a leader in our profession, that's a deep concern of how a free expression of the lasting legacy of that. And one of the things that we talked about is not just the effects on the press, but also explaining some of the broader themes historically, like the effects of propaganda, fascism, and their role in history, and how that compares to what was happening today and throughout the Trump presidency. And also, I think we also wanted to make sure that we talked about, what is it that that the Biden-Harris team may seek to do to try to stake out their own territory, and what are they going to change about what the Trump-Pence team left behind, and what the ripple effect of that will be. So we've had to sort of juggle all of those things at the same time, but also recognizing that the election story was not the only game in town. And I took some notes about, when you go back 18 months back from election day, what our leads were back to August of 2019. For example, the lead was in Yemen, the Houthis versus the Saudi Emirati-backed forces, Ebola in the DRC, and the U.S. imposed sanctions on Iran Zarif. Those were the top three stories. You didn't get to the Democratic debates until 35 minutes into the newscast. And that was back in August of 2019. So you have to remind people that everything is a matter of perspective. And when you start rolling through, it's still, month after month after month, it's a long time before you get to the elections as the lead story. But we are covering that. We were covering that story and continue to cover that story. And now we're trying to explain constantly, either through not just our spot reporting, not just breaking news and regular reporting, but through our expanded discussion shows, our 30-minute shows like Inside Story, our presence online, reporters' notebooks, and just a number of avenues to make sure that people try to understand not just what happened, but why and why it matters. And I think
Thanks.
that's enough time.
Thanks, Jeff. Interesting context for the American elections are not always the lead story around the world. Vasily, let's go to you. Vasily Gatov, as we heard earlier, the Russian leader has only just congratulated President-elect Biden. And so have people in Russia been waiting, watching all of these developments and holding off?
Yes. Russia, as kind of mediated society, had been addicted to American elections since I think 2004, when probably for the first time really it kind of the whole process, especially the final stages between were televised in Russia as if it was in America. I mean, with the continued coverage of election result, counting, and so on. That was just done, I think, because they realized that this is an interesting kind of and cheap to cover event first. And somehow it was very much it very much surprised the audience as well, and they started to follow the whole story. And Obama elections in 2008 were already getting very much attention from the general public. So since then, Russian media in general is very, very attentive to what happens in America. The problem is that as in many countries that's like semi-free or not really free countries, we have several media systems. We have kind of a general media that almost totally controlled by Kremlin, with high audiences, total access to public. Then we have kind of independent and well, professionally ethical media. It's a small segment, but it exists, that try to be neutral, that try to be objective to the facts. And we also have a lot of partisan media that since 2016 were either very much pro-Trump and smaller part that was very anti-Trump. It's interesting how people in journalism particularly, and kind of and on the edges between journalism and activism, picked up this story as a substitution to Russia's own elections, which are not free and fair and open and so on. Because I mean, kind of a normality for most of the Russians is that their elections are falsified in order to provide Putin with the next term, united Russia, the ruling party, with another majority in State Duma or local legislatures. So that created a kind of a specific bubble, not in the terms like Ambassador was speaking about, bubbles, safe bubbles, but kind of huge filter bubbles that some of the people were absolutely sure in Russia that Trump will win. Others were as much as American media inclined to see Biden's victory. And it's interesting that kind of all the strange oddities that Russian public opinion has about America were reflected in this. Like even in the latest coverage of what had happened after November 3, the Russian media had split into staunchly pro-Trump party, mostly represented by opinion pages of government-controlled newspapers and online media. I mean, you wouldn't find this level of emotions and kind of general discussion about how broken and how wrong is American democracy if such things happen. A little more neutral group of like reporters who cover in the field in America, because they understand that they cannot solidarize with all this opinion writers who continually, well, for whom the agenda looks like that. America is falling, American world order is falling. Trump was a genius who wanted to sort of reestablish America on his own terms, and then all these corrupt Democrats, they steal elections from him, and he's fighting back. I mean, this was. I mean, I have a lot of pages open in my computer right now, which almost constantly say that, and they say that every day on talk shows in Russia, political talk shows. I don't know about today. I mean, about yesterday and today. I didn't follow it, unfortunately, yesterday. But in fact, that's the stand. And of course, it plays very well, even the objective, I mean, like neutral coverage, into Putin's propaganda narrative that America is kind of a falling giant, that multipolar world order that Russia sees as its own order to invade neighboring countries, change governments, and so and all. I mean, kill people with nerve agents. I don't know. I mean, how they can be more happy about what was happening here in the United States for the last month, because that's a perfect demonstration of their righteousness and, well, their correct depiction of the story. But the very moment then they realized that Biden actually won, and it's definitely happened not yesterday or today when Putin congratulated President-elect, the tone of every official, of everyone who is even remotely adjusted to diplomacy in Russia became very reserved and neutral. Deputy Foreign Minister Rybkov said that he hopes for Biden to extend INF treaty. Immediately, I mean, even Putin himself said that he would work with Biden because he hopes that they know each other for quite a while, and so on. So official position is we are open. I mean, we don't want, but the thing that happened in Russia in last probably 5-7 years, that something you can call media clique of this propaganda machine of state-owned media, state-controlled media, they created kind of their own set of ideas and narratives that they push out regardless of real Kremlin position in that. And there's already been a couple of cases then they directly contradict Kremlin on some of especially foreign policy issues. The most visible is was about coronavirus pandemic in the early days when Russian government was formulating the position on how to deal with coronavirus. This Russian state-controlled media went absolutely nuts about, I mean, the Chinese, Chinese not responsible, Americans created it as AIDS in Fort Detrick, and so on and so on. That was kind of an outburst while the official government position was much more restricted and neutral and like trying to soften the situation in people's minds and so on. So I would say, coming back, I mean, we will see in the next few months a competition between state, I mean, the government, the diplomacy narrative that would be calm, and I think would expect it to be more friendly towards Biden, who for Putin is a known evil. And the unofficial narrative that would come from propaganda machine would be further destruction of an image of American democracy in brains of Russian public. That's for sure.
Thank you, Vasily, and we're going to open the floor for discussion shortly. But first, let's come back to the Americas, starting with Jacqueline Charles, the Caribbean and Haiti correspondent for the Miami Herald. And Jacqueline, the last time I saw you, you were saying that the Haitian government also was holding back congratulating the president-elect Biden.
Yes, so they were, they actually did it the day that the announcement was made, but they were pretty late in their congratulations. You know, there's a reputation that the Haitian government is supported by President Trump because of its position with Venezuela. It broke ties with Venezuela and Maduro and supported the Trump administration's sanctions against that government. So Haiti and Venezuela, they have a historical relationship. Simon Bolivar, when he wanted to promote independence in South America, he came to Haiti, and this is where he was assisted and even created the Venezuelan flags on the shores of Haiti. So there's that historical relationship that's there. And very early in President Jovenel Moise's term in 2017, he was actually bucking the U.S., doing things that was not favorable, that the U.S. frowned upon. And then at some point he switched gears and then was just supporting the U.S. So in that, we did not hear up until recently any sort of public criticism of his administration. He has been ruling by decree executive order for a year come January after Parliament was dissolved. So, you know, throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, and I'm in Miami, so, you know, Latin America, Caribbean sneezes, Miami catches a cold. So if you want to get the pulse of what's happening in the region, you can also look in Miami, and it sort of mirrors itself. I think that this region has been more interested in the US election in terms of outcome rather than process, because if you look at the last 4 years of the Trump administration, analysts will tell you that there's probably 3 words that sort of defined it and its relationship with this region, which is often referred to as the third border. There's been an indifference in the sense that the kind of engagement that they've seen from the United States in previous years, like it or not, they really did not see this from the Trump administration. Basically, Latin American policy from the Trump administration boiled down to one country, it's Venezuela. And with that, you had sort of this divisiveness. So whether you are with us or you are against us. So you saw with the Caribbean, for instance, a grouping of 15 countries known as CARICOM, the Caribbean Community. I mean, they were divided on the issue of Venezuela, and it no longer became just about Venezuela, but whether or not you wanted to be, you know, on the good side of President Trump. And so he had a meeting last year in Mar-a-Lago in West Palm Beach County, where there were 5 Caribbean leaders who were invited, and you saw where they stood on the Venezuela question. And then in January, it was really stark when Secretary of State Mike Pompeo flew to Jamaica to meet with invited Caribbean leaders in Jamaica, even though the country of Barbados was actually the chair of CARICOM, you know, at the time. And probably the other word has been absent. I mean, when we look at this region and in terms of all the problems and all of the issues, there has been this absence of the United States in its presence. So for, well, you know, good or bad, like it or not, for whatever selfish reasons, you know, leaders in this region have been looking at the US through the prism of their own selfish desires, whether it is to have a different, more meaningful relationship with the United States, or in the case of Haiti, the opposition who thinks that Biden's going to come in and suddenly support their plan for a transition and kick President Jovenel Moise out. That's sort of where they're looking. Cuba, is looking to see what's going to happen as far as the US. Remember, Obama did a lot of opening of Cuba, but what the experts are saying to us is that even if Biden wants to go back to some of those Obama era decisions, he's not going to be able to because of the Hispanic vote in the US election, especially the Cuban vote. President Trump has had a legacy in those 4 years. I mean, he has put his stamp, and even on the issue of Venezuela, there's a lot of debate about the failure of the U.S. policy in Venezuela. Maduro is still there. He just had legislative elections. He has now consolidated his power. So what happens to Guaido, who the Trump administration says you have to support him? So I think it's going to be a very interesting time. Everybody's looking to see who Biden puts, in charge of Western Hemisphere. Who are the policy hawks? People have said to me, well, at least one thing will be sure is that he's going to put grown-ups there, people who know diplomacy, as opposed to political appointees that we've seen in the last 4 years. And what that has boiled down to is in individual countries, it has been left to the individual US ambassadors to sort of figure out what to do next, with not very much direction from Washington. Someone earlier sort of, is there a positive thread in how these elections have rolled out, right? I mean, people were joking in Haiti. So, who's going to call the UN to come in and to settle this, right? Because Haiti is used to the US butting its nose in its elections. And I had a source who said to me after the whole issue went to the Supreme Court and they rejected it, he says, do you think Haitians will appreciate what it means to have an independent judiciary? So I think for Latin America, there are some positive threads. I mean, they never profess to really understand how American politics work, despite the relationships they've had with the US. But I think that in looking at the independence of the judiciary, the independence of municipalities and states in this decision, that while President Trump's behavior may have reminded them of some of their own leaders, they saw the other side in terms of the ability of institutions, strong institutions, to counter that. So I will just leave it there, and then people can ask questions.
Very good points about independent judiciary, but also about ambassadors. And we have a number of ambassadors in our group today. Anita Lee, you have the last word among panelists for the reaction from where you are in Canada, from your perspective, both as a journalist, the Online News Association, but also as someone who teaches journalism at Centennial College there in Toronto, and also at City University of New York. So, Anita Lee.
Thank you, Adam. And hi, everybody. Thanks to USC for having me. So just for a bit more context, I'm a journalist who's worked at legacy and emerging publications in Canada. And I also worked in the United States for a spell, having had the opportunity to cover the last 2016 presidential election. And I was based in New York City at the time and had reporters in DC, Florida, and New York. So in terms of Canada's perception of the US election, historically, given that the US is our neighbor and biggest trading partner, Canadians have always been invested in the outcome of American elections. But post-Trump, after his rise in 2015, after he won the election in 2016, we took an even keener interest in this most recent election between Trump and Biden, given how chaotic the last 4 years of Trump's administration was, and how his unprecedented style of governance led to unprecedented tension in the Canada-US relationship. And also the fact that public opinion, or Canadian public opinion of the US is at an all-time low in Canada. So Canadians actually tune into American news outlets, or very often tune into American news outlets during American elections because of the US's historical cultural influence on our country. We're brothers or sisters or cousins, however you like to call it. So we've been heavily impacted by American culture and soft power for decades. I myself followed a lot of the US election coverage beyond the Globe and Mail, which is our newspaper of record. I read the New York Times, I read the Washington Post, and on election night, I watched CNN. And in fact, CNN got more Canadian viewers on the US election night on November 3rd than the top two Canadian broadcasters combined, which are CBC, which is our national broadcaster, and CTV. And it was actually the first time, November 3rd was the first time that CTV covered the entirety of the US election night, which was quite historic. And that, that suggests that Canadians were even more invested in this most recent election. And given that we share a border with the US, Canadian media's framing of the stories is very much about how another 4 years of Trump would have impacted us, and our historically close relationship, or how 4 years of Biden would impact us. And with the Biden coverage now, there's less uncertainty, but a lot of concern about how he will go about repairing the damage that Trump has done, especially in media analysis or political analysis of the election. For example, Trump did away with NAFTA, which impacted trade and also a lot of Canadian workers with TN visas. And a lot of the Canadian focus has also been how American polarization is impacting Canada. It's kind of interesting given our roots and the fact that we were loyalists and Americans were rebels. There's this kind of weird moral superiority that comes out among Canadians, and I think in some ways, although we're also very concerned, there's a degree of moral superiority given that in Canada we were one of only 10. We're one of the only countries with a top 10 global economies that actually did not elect a populist leader in our last federal election. So there's kind of this sense that, we're a stable country. We know that America and American politics and its divisiveness is impacting us, but we can hold the center. CBC, like I said, is our national broadcaster. They often dictate the status quo around best practices in Canadian journalism, but they're very known and notorious for being very focused on neutrality and objectivity and balance. So the framing in CBC and other establishment outlets treated Trump in a very kind of neutral and objective way throughout the election campaign, which really diverged a lot from a lot of establishment outlets, even in the US, including the Times and Washington Post. That said, when Trump made baseless claims about the validity of the election results recently, Canadian coverage has been more pointed. So I have a lot more to say beyond that, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita, and thanks to all of our panelists for a very rich discussion of how the U.S. election is being explained and how the world is viewing the U.S. The floor is open for questions. We have one from Ambassador Greta Morris, who has technical difficulties, so she emailed it, asking whether anybody has seen particular reactions to the election of, as the vice president-elect, a woman of color, whether that has resonated in any of your regions, if anyone would like to join.
Yes, I covered Jamaica, and so in Jamaica, there was just a huge amount of pride. What's interesting was that the day that President-elect Biden announced Kamala as his running mate, it was the same day that the Jamaican government announced that they would be going into a general elections amid the COVID pandemic. And so the announcement got a little bit overshadowed, but some of us who've been watching Jamaica very closely and watching its cozying up to the Trump administration sort of snickered and said, okay, this is going to be a very sticky situation for them, because here you are having someone of Jamaican descent who could be the first, Black person of color, vice president of the United States, and she is, of Jamaican descent, and yet you also want to continue to curry a good relationship, with the Trump administration. So you don't want to publicly look like you take sides. So I think that they were really sort of holding their breath until the decisions were actually made. But I'll just say this, what's interesting is when President Barack Obama ran and when he became the first Black president of the US, there was such an excitement all over the Caribbean. You would have thought that they actually voted in the US elections and this was going to be their president. There was just this enormous sense of pride. And, it was a much more toned down with Harris, but I think a lot of that also has to do with the uncertainty that they just didn't know going into these US elections, whether or not Trump was going to emerge for another 4 years or whether or not Biden was going to be able to pull it off. So everybody was just holding their breath.
And Jeff
Adam,
Ballou, I see you
yeah.
have unmuted yourself.
Yeah, because the Americas is part of our patch, we very much covered the historic aspect of Vice President-elect Harris's naming and we also and all the things that went with it, to the extent we even tracked down a Howard University classmate of hers, and we went down that road. But it was for very different reasons. Jackie talked about the fact that possibly overshadowed by the elections in Jamaica. For us, it was because it was being overshadowed by the sitting president of the United States. I mean, he just dominates the news cycle, if for better or for worse. Whether I can't remember exactly what the story was that he was engaged with that day, but what should have been the absolute historic lead had competition because of the president and because of other stories in the cycle. So but we'll see what happens. I think one of the things that we also covered at the time is whether or not, yes, that the history is nice, but at that point can the ticket win? And now it's, can the ticket govern? Because one thing I didn't say in my initial remarks is that, the Biden-Harris team is going to be dealing with what amounts to a shadow presidency in Donald Trump. He's not going away quiet like his predecessors. So that's going to be a factor going forward.
Anita Lee, you also had unmuted yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So racial discussions have definitely bled over from the US into Canada. And the first time in our history, we've actually been having, our public discourse has been centered around having candid discussions about race. And in fact, one of my students, my journalism students have told me that they'd be able to tell me the history of systemic racism in America, but would be hard pressed to tell me the same about the history of systemic racism in Canada. So needless to say, racial reckoning is happening in Canadian media and other institutions. And given that we're a pluralistic and multicultural country, we have multiculturalism entrenched in our constitution. So there was a lot of fanfare around the fact that Kamala Harris was voted in as vice president-elect, though it was tempered because Canadians still have some reticence around so openly discussing race. In fact, we seldom collect race-based data and have only started having discussions across institutions about the fact that we should be doing that. But there was some fanfare.
And again, the floor is open for questions and comments. You can raise your hand or signal our producer in Korea, Judy Kang. I'd like to follow up very quickly. Anton, Harber, in Africa, has there been much reaction to the election of a woman of color as a vice president?
I certainly think it's been noted as part of the general shift from a Trump administration to a new and quite different one. And certainly it has resonated with many people here to see the first woman of color in such a senior position. I don't know of much specific response because I think it was, the focus was on the election as a whole and the uncertainty of the election as a whole. But I think it was definitely, there was a positive and notable response to her presence on the ticket.
Vasily Gatov.
Yeah, I want to underline two things. I mean, well, Russian political establishment in general is pretty racist and pretty anti-feminist. So again, as I noted in my report to you earlier, the kind of the media clique knows it, the Russian media clique, propaganda machine, whatever you call it, knows it and definitely plays. So in the very first moments, then it became clear that Kamala Harris would be vice president of the United States. They sort of, they put some effort in ridiculing her, picking up all the worst things that been said about her in American right-wing media. But closer the elections become and more clear the potential Biden victory became, they kind of softened it down, and in fact, even even RT made a very kind of profound and supporting profile of Kamala. I think it was November 7 when they did it. So in fact, they're moderating this in their outbursts of hate in general to kind of another races and women. But the interesting detail about Russian reaction was that the future appointment of Jen Psaki as a speaker for the White House, that raised an enormous outburst of emotions in Moscow, because for years when she worked with Obama administration as a speaker for Department of State, they created a kind of a monstrous figure from Jen, because I don't know how it happened in details, but she was ridiculed for several mistakes she did. Most known of them was that then she said that the gas flows from Europe to Russia, but immediately corrected herself. But Russian media only kind of picked up the first part of the phrase and started to enlarge this mistake to an enormous extent. I mean, saying that, oh, Americans don't know anything about Russia, about Russian geography, and so on. And they even invented several mistakes by Jen Psaki to kind of strengthen this image of kind of wrong peaks of American administration. So that's a detail that I think you would also like to know.
Interesting. I see Anton raising his hand. Anton?
Yeah, I would like to ask whether in your countries it raised or has plugged into the American elections, and the role of the media has plugged into local debates about partisan media and issues of neutrality and objectivity. It certainly has in South Africa, where we were in the midst of quite important debates about the relationship between political reporters and various factions within our ruling party, and the role being played by elements of the media that have become increasingly partisan. But watching the role of particularly the partisan media in America, I think was sobering for a lot of us, and important in us thinking about how we deal with those issues. So I'd be interested to know if that was true for others in the media in different places.
Anybody want to take that?
Yeah.
I know. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jackie.
Well, as a reporter on the ground for a correspondent, I have to tell you, this whole narrative about fake news coming out of the United States has been a huge disservice to journalism and to the media. Because I cover countries where you do have, partisan media, you do have issues about, journalists being paid, accepting money. You have a complete lack of comprehension on the part of, from the average person on the street to even people who are in leadership jobs, in terms of what does it mean to be an objective journalist and not have an agenda. But when you have a president in the US that is constantly, attacking the media, calling it fake news, it unfortunately presents this very bad narrative And it's been very challenging to do our work. Jeff, I'll take it to you.
Sure. Oops. I think all right. I accidentally took my video off. Yeah, completely agree with what Jackie said. And I would add to that, insofar as how our network treated it, both in our reporting and our analysis. We have a media analysis show called Listening Post, where we analyze the role of the press in various countries. We've dug into that to that several times through guests on air when it's become such a prominent part of the president's narrative. And I echo exactly what Jackie was talking about. It made life hard on those who were actually doing the job and doing the job right. And what you had is not just, it wasn't just a function of what the president did, but the fact that he was echoing attacks on the press that were echoed by Boris Johnson, that were echoed by Vladimir Putin, that were being echoed all over the world. And then it had a trickle, pardon the Reagan phrase, trickle down effect on other levels of civic, public officials. And so you had, city council or city mayors, leaders throwing reporters out of meetings and on public property, decrying quote unquote fake news, invoking the language of propaganda, the language of fascism, the language studied by people like Jason Stanley and Timothy Snyder at Yale. It's going to be something that is going to be hanging over our heads for a very, very long time. And because it was not just adopted by leaders, it's been adopted by some partisan aspects of the media. I hesitate to say press because, those in the press are doing it right, are trying to do it right and do it well. But there are those who have adopted these tactics that are against every basic rule of journalism that most of us have learned all over the world. And it undermines our ability to act with authority to the point where journalists have been jailed, harassed, and in some rare cases even killed. So that's a problem.
Let me just add, I was actually on the front line of this issue, and it was a very uncomfortable place to be. President-elect Biden, when he was campaigning, came to South Florida and he met with the Haitian community. And so I was invited by the campaign to cover that event as a local reporter, even though they had pool press. But because I had written a very critical story about the Democratic campaign and them ignoring this important voting bloc. So, there was all these arrangements that were made. So while there, I'm doing what journalists do. I'm recording, I'm filming, I'm taking pictures, I'm writing, I'm doing it all. And there was a moment at the end where people wanted to take photos, and there had been some dancers, traditional Haitian dancers, who had welcomed the vice president and his wife, and they wanted to take a photo. And so to ensure that everybody could be seen in the background, he kneeled down, which was, before 2020 was a very common thing to do, right? So, and it was such a colorful photo and a powerful photo, and not thinking Black Lives Matter or protest or any of this. As a matter of fact, the Haitian media in Haiti had this picture on their front page. My own paper did not run my picture on the front page. They ran it inside. But then Fox News took this photo and wrote a story about Biden taking a knee. Suddenly on a Sunday, I'm getting calls from other journalists, USA Today, other newspapers that are doing a fact check and wanting to know the circumstances around this photo. And I just have to tell you, as a journalist, I just want to do my job. I just want my words and what I put out there to stand on its own and let the reader decide. But all of a sudden, having to defend my work product or having to explain or be interviewed was just very uncomfortable, because one media of all the things that happened that day, took that one image and decided to spin it another way. And all of a sudden, everybody, all the journalists in the media, we get painted with this brush that, oh, this is what we do. And I would just finally say, to me, there is no debate. People like to say, oh, Fox News versus CNN, and this one is this and this one is that. For people who really study the media, who read newspapers, who follow the news, I don't think that they will say that is. I think, but it's people who have bought into this whole fake news and what the president has put out there. And now all of a sudden we find ourselves in the same boat as many other countries. And as journalists, we are now under attack. And that is very sad. That to me has been a sad legacy of the last 4 years.
Anita Lee.
Yeah, so in response to Anton's question, yes, there's been so much public debate about the notion of objectivity in journalism, and I myself have appeared on several panels about this topic. So places like CBC and other establishment media have been criticized in some quarters for their uncritical embrace of objectivity, because that approach to news gathering doesn't necessarily lend itself to truth all the time. And critics say that the sense is that objectivity can lead to a false equivalence. For example, equating climate deniers with climate scientists, or equating white supremacists with Black Lives Matter protesters. So there's a growing independent digital media ecosystem in Canada that's challenging status quo best practices in Canadian journalism, both from a business and editorial standpoint, including objectivity. And the reason is because some believe also that objectivity reinforces the status quo and dominant power structures, especially since, for example, Canadian newsrooms across the country, especially in leadership, are quite homogenous. And so there's also been a demand recently in Canadian media among the public, among certain quarters of Canadian media, for more, for underrepresented communities to be better represented in media stories, and also within the actual newsroom itself. And there's a desire to challenge this notion of an ultimate objective truth, for example. So there's a growing sense among certain spaces that transparency may be a good kind of, not replacement, but another alternative to objectivity, showing your work while also being fact-based and rigorous in your reporting. So there's just a lot more experimentation with that notion, though obviously objectivity is still very much the status quo in this country.
And
Thank you.
Adam, can I just throw one other quick thing on that? Two quick things. One is that a lot of us have been in over the course of this cycle and over the course of this presidency have been put in the very uncomfortable transition of usually when we analyze the presidency and things are not factually, correct, we're trying to use the most polite language possible. And what we found ourselves as a profession is moving into, just thinking, a lot of us calling a thing, basically saying it's a lie, right? Instead of saying, oh, it's factually incorrect, or it's some euphemism. And now many of us have starting to simply hit the nail on the head, and that that triggers something in terms of how we are treated as colleagues and by our readers, listeners, and viewers, and how we treat each other, because we're trying to say, well, have we hit rock bottom that we're no longer dispassionate? But that's one of the unfortunate effects of this presidency, is that it's latched on to such tactics of lying. You have to say it, but you have to put it in context. That's important. You can't look like you're simply name calling. You have to say why. You have to say, is there a history there? Have his predecessors engaged in the same behavior, and things of that nature? So when I think of, I didn't go what Jackie went through. I remember being on the primary trail and being in Las Vegas with a correspondent at a Trump rally, and having the Trump, having his supporters, heckle my correspondent and I. But I'm sure it's not nearly as bad as maybe what Jackie went through, or what maybe Jim Acosta's gone through when he got his hat snatched by the White House, and a lot of our colleagues, and some, of course, famously our colleague from the Guardian, who was body slammed by a congressional candidate, Greg Gianforte, who went on to run for and win his seat after the fact. you know, we have a lasting problem that we have to tackle.
Thank you. And we have a question from Michael Anderson.
I would like to ask any of the panelists, including you, Adam, because you're an expert on the media in Washington scene. Do you think there are any practical steps that the new Biden administration could take on the broad area of press, government relations, or support for press freedom? For example, there's been a suggestion that Congress set up a commission on press freedom, or the suggestion that at this big conference that Biden wants to call on democracy, press freedom should be a key part of that agenda. So if any of you have any thoughts on practical tips.
I'd like to bring in Insun Kang, who's still with us in Seoul, in the early morning hours. Do you have any thoughts on this, having been in Washington for 4 years? And you'll need to unmute yourself. I think you're still muted. There we go.
Yeah, I'm good. Could you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm half asleep now. So yeah, I don't really remember the Mr. Biden mentioned something about the press, the freedom of press or something, because I thought it was so basic that I wonder whether we need to discuss that. But when you think of the days of President Trump, I guess the way that the US media, how they reported on the presidency and what he has been doing, I think it's totally out of control, in the sense that you don't even have your press briefing, and then there's no coordination or balanced way of conveying the president opinion to people. So it's always President Trump's own way of tweeting or some other things. So just going back to normal, how to deal with media and press, I think that's the basic thing that we just keep on doing. So that's what I have observed so far. Yeah.
And while we have you, I know it's after 1 in the morning there, so thank you for staying with us. We haven't read very much in the United States about reaction from media or the leadership or people of North Korea. What is that? What are you seeing from there to the U.S. election?
U.S. election. Well, actually, North Korea had said something harsh about the president-elect Mr. Biden a couple of months ago. But after the election's over and his victory, Mr. Biden's victory is almost confirmed, and they have been silent since then. So our understanding is that usually they calculated very carefully how to do their first move. So when we recall our when we go back to the 2017 and 2008, when there's a new government, North Korean way of introducing themselves is launching long-range missiles or doing some nuclear tests. So they introduced themselves by that way, and then they are waiting for the US reaction, what are they gonna do with them, and then that's how they started contact with the United States. They set the environment. How do they wanna build a new relationship with the United States by showing that how strong they are, so that they just set the tone for the dialogue or negotiation. But usually it's up to U.S. government how how to proceed the next step. But so far, what we have found is that North Korea is still calculating what is the best way for them to start the relations with the new government. And I interviewed one of the most important North Korea expert in the U.S. now is Andrew Kim, who was the former Korea missions head of Korean mission center in CIA. And I interviewed him, and he just suggested North Korea that now just do not try any provocation as you did before, like a missile test or nuclear test. Try some other ways, like, you can invite Mr. Biden to Pyongyang. Then it could change the whole, horizon. So I think that's a good way of, inducing North Korea to be back to the dialogue or any kind of new conversation with outside of the world.
Well, that's actually a good point on which to end our discussion. If any of the other panelists would like to address how moving forward, whether it's the leadership or whether it's through public diplomacy with people of different countries around the world, how do we see a new tone being set in various parts of the world, if anyone wants to address that? I see no hands raised.
Adam.
Oh, Vasily.
Yeah, thank you. I think that while Russia is definitely not the most important country in the world for United States, it's important arrogance for American policies. And I think that this issue of like press freedom or is an important thing for Russian society, especially because there are not that much independent media and not that much independent voices in Russia, in Putin's Russia. I think one of the key issues, strangely enough, in future relationship of Biden administration with Russia, would be kind of retuning or newly tuning Voice of America, Radio Liberty, and other Russian language services that work on Russia. And I think you have Tom Kent, who even wrote a book about that recently. On your next meeting, this is a very, very, very important issue, especially because it connects public diplomacy, journalism, government, and issues of freedom of the press. And addressing the situation, quite dire situation actually, that American media in general, not only Russian language government-owned media, but in general Russian media, is currently in Russia, it would be very important and not particularly helping, but very emotionally important part of the future policies. So my advice to the next administration and next foreign policy team would be to put attention on AGM immediately and look into the issues, what they're doing under directions of this Trump appointee, and probably reverse it. Thanks.
Thank you. Jeff Ballou, you have the last word.
Adam, I think there's, even though we've been through a tumultuous period with the press with this particular presidency, it shouldn't be lost on us that press relations between the Obama administration and the press weren't that great. And he has brought back a lot of people who were a part of that, including Jen Psaki. So, we had the spy scandal with DOJ. We had there's a list of things that happened during the Obama years that are just not pretty. And I would hope that the incoming administration will look at those things and not return to some of those old practices. In addition, of course, not engaging in the massive demagoguery that's happened with the Trump years.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks to all of our panelists in alphabetical order: Jeff Ballou, Jacqueline Charles, Vasily Gatov, Anton Harber, Insun Kang, Anita Lee, and the ambassador Ashok Mirpuri. As Vas said, our next program will be on Monday, January 4th, the regular first Monday program with Tom Kent, formerly of the Associated Press, former CEO of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, talking about his new book, Overt and Covert Options to Combat Russian Disinformation. And I'm sure he'll also be talking about the U.S. Agency for Global Media. So until then, thanks to all of you for joining us, and we're adjourned.